ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Hi there, my name is Matt Petrowsky. I've been a FileMaker software developer for well over 20 years, and the video that you're about to watch is a live stream that I recorded live. Now, if the content that you find doesn't really match what you're looking for, it's very possible that this is a video that's part of a series. So if it doesn't make sense where you're finding this particular video, then just click on the description down below and you will find a link that will take you to the full series, and you can start with video number 1 and go through all of the videos in sequence. If you like the content and it helps you out, then great. If you'd like more information, then you can always check me out at FileMakerMagazine.com. All right, let's do one more video for today. I am going to be planning out my structure. I think that's what I put for the title of this particular video. So in our solution, what we have is we currently have, when we look at our tables, we have one table and we have two table occurrences. Now up to this point, we have not added any type of structure to this file. We can see in our relationship graph, it's super simple. We always want to remember that when we have a base table, such as this in this case called capture, we can have any number of table occurrences. In other words, I can option drag these and you can see that I have a bunch of different occurrences. Now in FileMaker, context, which is one of the most important things to learn and understand, is that what you do and where you do it sometimes matters. I say sometimes because it doesn't always matter, because what we typically try to do in our development is try to make as many things context independent so that if we decide to change things up later down the road, we're not tied to any changes that happen in this relationship graph. Now the relationship graph, as I get rid of all of these, and you'll see that I can select all of them by passing the marquee over, and then I can delete them by clicking this. If I click this, it will ask me if I want to delete them. If I hold down the magic option key, they will just go away. So as you develop, if you're sure that you want to do something and you do not want to be warned or you don't like being asked, you can hold down the option key in all of FileMaker and just get rid of things. So context is established based on where you are in the solution, what that layout is tied to, and then what that particular table occurrence can see. So in this case, when we think about our solution, this layout we can see clearly is tied, in this case FileMaker says table, but it's not actually tied to the table capture. It's not tied to this. It is in essence, but only through virtue of the fact that this table occurrence is called capture. So watch what happens when I rename this to whatever I want and say okay. We'll go over here, actually we'll accept this, and we go into, we don't even need to go into browse mode, but you can see right here, this does not make sense to a lot of FileMaker developers. They're like, this is tied to the table, whatever I want. No, it's not. It's tied, what this layout will show and what these fields are, where they're coming from the capture table, but I have named the table occurrence, the ghost or the pointer of that, to whatever I want. So it's very confusing when FileMaker starts up. You name your base table, FileMaker makes the table occurrence the same name, but as soon as it gets a different name, we get a disconnect here. And so what we have to know is that when FileMaker says table, what it means is it's tied to the table occurrence, whatever I want, and then what it should show right here next to it is the table capture. That would make a lot more sense to a lot of people, but it's just something that we have to get used to in terms of understanding. So I am going to start to create my structure in the solution. I've told you that I'm going to treat this as a utility table, meaning it's preemptively capturing the data before the data goes into my tables, which become my solution. So over in tables, I am going to call a table simply called people. Now there is a very, very good reason for this, and that is because in this solution, I am dealing with people. I am not dealing with patients. I am not dealing with students. I am not dealing with infected people. I am dealing with people. This is a very, very important concept to get when it comes to structuring your database, especially if you're learning FileMaker or learning how to build a database and normalize data. Most of the time, people are thinking strictly within the confines of what they are familiar with. If you have a project, then you're thinking in terms of a project. If you have a client, you're thinking in terms of that client. But that client is not a client just to you. It's also a parent to a child. It's an employee to a company. But ultimately, what it is fundamentally is a person. So going down to your lowest level of what something is and describing it in that fashion is almost always better than describing it within the confines of how you think of things. Maybe you have clients, but guess what? Within a table called people where we track information about a person, we can classify whether that person is a client or a student or a teacher or whatever. Classifying data is much easier to do than putting a structure behind something that's very limited. So, diatribe over, I will create my table, all of my fields will be created, and I'll now be able to create the fields that I want. Now again, there's multiple ways that you can create fields. I can create the fields here. Let's take a look at the other option. I can go to the people table and I might be able to create the fields here. Nope, FileMaker's not going to let me. That's because in order to use this feature of new field, it really only works when you're on the context that the layout is tied to. Layout's tied to capture, so if I'm on a layout where I want to create fields, this new field will work. We can see right down there it created a new field. Blah for right now. And I can change the field types right here if I wanted. Also, if I didn't already show you, when I am in browse mode, of the three modes of view that FileMaker has, form, list, and table, within table view, if I was in table view, I would be able to create a field here as well. So this is another new field. And when I go into define database, we will see on capture, there's blah that I created in the one method, and there's another new field that I created in the other method. So selecting both of those, I'll hold down my magic option key, get rid of them, delete them because I know I want them gone, but very dangerous. Don't do it unless you know that you are okay with it. So here's a very interesting thing. Context, when it comes to working in FileMaker, also applies to when you are working in FileMaker. That seems a little confusing, but let's open up the Manage Layouts Manage Layouts. Now, one thing that FileMaker inconveniently does, and I say inconvenient because it's not always what you want, under our relationships, let's go to our tables. As soon as I created this people table, FileMaker made some assumptions for us. It said, oh, okay, you want a table. That means you want a table occurrence, and it also means you want a layout. That's not always the case. We go over to relationships. You can see FileMaker automatically created this, even if I might not want it. Most of the time you do, but there's sometimes you don't. FileMaker also, in our Manage Layouts, automatically made a people layout. So, a very important concept in FileMaker is that FileMaker, as you are developing, and notice that when I renamed my table occurrence from whatever I want back to capture, do you notice that the layout didn't actually match that? So I'd have to go in, double click this, and rename it to capture to match what I want. Capture, there we go. So back to that whole context thing. Watch what happens, and this is all through FileMaker. This one lesson will help you immensely when you're creating scripts or when you're dealing with certain script steps, when you're scripting down the road. FileMaker takes into account whatever the frontmost window is. And we know that because here, selected on this layout, let's look at both of them actually right here so that we can see both of them. Zoom in. I am currently in a window tied to a table occurrence on the layout that's tied to people. When I go into Manage Database, notice that I default into the people table. So I'm now going to get rid of this dialog. I'm going to select this window and I'm going to bring up the Manage Database again. Notice that FileMaker has paid attention to the fact that the table occurrence, that the layout of the window that I am looking at is tied to, FileMaker defaults to that particular table. So in order to emphasize this point, and it doesn't exactly have to do with structure, I'm going to go into the scripting workspace, somewhere where you spend a lot of time. Currently, this is the Frontmost window. I am going to add a set field step. When I hit the space bar to bring that up and specify, notice that FileMaker picks the capture as my table that it assumes I want to pick fields from, because that's the Frontmost window. If I simply just go over to this window, go back to the scripting workspace, go to that, and now it might work. There we go. Notice that FileMaker switched context based on the Frontmost window. When the capture was Frontmost, it said, oh, you must want fields from capture. Otherwise, you must want fields from people. This becomes really helpful when you're developing a lot of the times, because you want to bring the table forward, or you may be working on a UI such as this, but you want to work on some structure of a connected table. Sometimes just having the window open and switching to it in order to bring up your defined database puts you right in the format that you want, or within scripts allows you to write your scripts a little bit faster. So with my structure, I now need to choose what I want out of the capture table into the people table. And this is where we start to name things and do it in a way that I prefer, that groups things. FileMaker supports all kinds of naming conventions. You can use mine, you can use some other conventions out there. I like to group things together. There's this option right here of view by, and you can view the fields in the order in which they are created, which is helpful if you're going into an older database system. If you go into an older database system and somebody has sorted the database by name, but you want to see what's the evolution of this database, you can switch it to the creation order, and it will tell you the exact order in which those fields were created from the top down. Really useful. Scroll to the bottom, you can see the most recently added fields. By default, in my opinion, the field name is the easiest to order them by. Field type is useful when you want to see how many different types of fields there are. For example, we've got a lot of text fields and we've got a lot of timestamps, no unstored calculations. That's a good thing. That means this database is going to be really fast. When I start to add a lot of unstored calculations, if they're on the layout, the solution may get slower. And custom order is something where I used to use this. It allows you to drag these in the order that you want to see them. This will become important when it comes to our relationships, but this is so easy to accidentally destroy just by going to field name. So I prefer field name, and I'm now going to add the minimal fields that I want. My original my scan of my license is capturing much more than I need. I just want to cherry pick what I want to have, and this is where I'm going to start to put things. Comments are really helpful on fields, and I highly suggest that you use them. You can see right here that it says unique identifier of each record in this table. If you click this to toggle, you will see the comments. FileMaker puts a comment on all of its auto-created fields. I suggest that you follow and do the same. It will help you out in the future. So I'm going to create name first. I'm not going to put first space name, because that becomes difficult, in my opinion, once you get a complex solution to determine out of code what's what. Spaces, in my opinion, is not a very good thing for names. Unfortunately for us, this is a decision that you have to make with regards to how users are going to use your FileMaker solution. Currently, FileMaker does not have a concept known as an alias name. So let's go ahead and create this field right now called first name and see where and why the impact is in terms of how I'm going to utilize FileMaker. I'll say OK. And in this window, when we bring up a sort dialog, that's with Command S or Control S, which I don't have any records, so let's add a new one. Now we can get a sort. Let's go ahead and click cancel so that we can see what the impact is. We need to add the field. I will drag it from the layout and we'll get that on the layout. So what users see if you use native FileMaker behaviors or features and functionality is that FileMaker just directly translates what you have in your fields to the rest of its UI. I bring up the sort dialog, and this makes sense to a lot of users. First space name. I can make this sort. I can see that this is a sort dialog. I can move this and say I want to sort this database based on the first name. That stands in conflict with you as a developer and trying to develop a very clean and easy to maintain solution. Technical debt is something that you will acquire as your FileMaker solution, or any software for that matter, grows. So when we go back in here and I talk about my naming, I like to name this name first with no spaces and change that, because if I put in name last, that groups it inherently with the other items when sorted by name, as opposed to last name being very separate from first name. First, if I could spell. They've now become split apart from each other. And as this grows, which right now 7 fields is super small, we will have very difficult future problems if it isn't easy to abstract the information that we've done of what we've created months prior. So grouping is always a very key thing, and I will always do this type of thing, name first, name last, at the consequence of when I am in that dialog, when I'm in that sort dialog, this may not make sense to people. Name first. I mean, it's readable, but it's not comfortable. That's why it would be really nice if FileMaker would give us field name aliases. It would simply just come in the form of another option right here, like a comment, where we'd be able to say, you know, what's the human readable name? And we would be able to use our developer name internally, and then the exposed name would be the name that we choose to give it. Unfortunately, we don't have that. Comments on this super simple name. I'm not going to put something that is super obvious necessarily on this comment, but as soon as my fields start to get a little obscure, then I'm going to be adding comments to those. I could very easily put this is the person's first name, and just go ahead and change that. If you like to have no breaks or spaces in here, then you certainly can. But if it's obvious, then I don't tend to use the comment. If I know it's not going to be obvious in the future, then I will use the comment. All right, so we now get to choose what we want in this solution. And since we're talking about structure, we're going to now address narrow versus wide. And I forgot to start my timer, but heck, I'll just go with it. Narrow versus wide is a concept that you must pay attention to from the outset when you are designing the structure of your database. And this is the most fundamental lesson I can teach you about a narrow versus a wide table. If you want a fast FileMaker solution and a fast system, you want narrow tables. If you want something that will get slower as you move forward developing that, go ahead and build a wide table. We've already learned this with the let function and using a custom function in order to abstract that, but it applies to data as well. This is a COVID solution. We're pretending somebody's pulling up. We scan a license. We capture the information. We're then going to scan a test tube or whatever's going to transport the medical information. Those two need to be associated. They're going to go off to the lab. We know how that works. We need a point of contact. That comes in the form of a phone number. I can type in phone number, and I can do it really generally here, but we now start the thinking process. This person, maybe work is paying for their COVID test. Maybe they're using their work phone number. Okay, fine. We'll put in phone work. Problem. This right now is a problem. A phone number as a point of contact is a type of data. It's a piece of data that you could have multiple. Most times when you can have multiple things, then you want to give them their own table. There's a concept called join tables, which we will look into. But at the point in time that I can see that is it possible that I would add another number here? This is old school. If you're under, I don't know, what, under 30, then you have no idea what a fax is. then you'll find this in older FileMaker systems where you have a phone fax, a phone work, a phone whatever. What we are doing is we are taking what was essentially a narrow table and we are now making it wide. Think of it in this way. When we are looking at this in table view, and if all of these were on the layout like such, what happens is this is a wide table. For every field that you are adding, if this scroll bar keeps getting smaller and you keep adding fields in terms of width in order to replicate data that is essentially the same type of data, tell yourself right then and there, am I making a wide table or am I making a narrow table? If you're making a wide table, then that means you need to rethink your data structure. So we want to capture a phone number, but we simply want to classify that as a certain type of phone number, whether it is a work number or a fax or a phone number. So that means phone numbers do not belong here as a point of contact information. Get rid of it, delete those fields. We have gone back to a narrow table. We now want to create another table to associate this information to this person. And of course, we can do it based on our keys. So I'm going to create a new table, and I can call this whatever I want. I usually call it details just to stay really clean and short in terms of how I do this. But if I can imagine that this solution is going to be a really big solution, maybe it's going to handle contact tracing. Maybe it's going to handle things within the lab environment of that setting. This is where you say, details, that's a little generic. I need to know that these are things associated to people. So you could do people details and create the table like that. Or you could say people contact information, whatever you want. Just remember formation. The longer you go, the longer your code becomes when you're writing that code. So if you can stay concise but also still very clear, that's going to be much better. So I'm just going to call this people details for right now, which it already is. And I am now going to connect it. The way that I'm going to connect this, we've got a narrow table, is I'm going to create a foreign key. So in order to create, well, let's create our phone number first off. Actually, you'll see I don't even need to call this phone number. See, I'm thinking in terms of a phone number right now in my head, but I know that all this is actually just a piece of information to communicate with that person. Think about this. What's another piece of information that can be used to communicate with a person? An email address. Is it possible to store both an email address and a phone number in the same field, but also know that they are distinctly different from each other? Yes, it is. So I don't have to call this necessarily phone. I can call this contact data. Now this seems abstract and obscure, but this is how you create a very efficient solution with very narrow tables that really can scale well in FileMaker. If you don't do this, if you're constantly adding fields, your structure will become really heavy-weighted and burdened. So I'll create that, and then I will create one called contact type, and I'll create that. All right. So we have simply two fields that we're now able to control what these are. Actually, I will create one third one, and that is because we have a human readable version. All right, so let's think about this. All right, so I have a person over in people. They're going to have a first name and a last name. They also have a primary key, something that absolutely identifies them. I also have this table called people details, and I only have 3 fields. I don't have phone 1, phone 2, phone 3, email 1, email 2, address 1, address 2, address 3. I am not creating a wide table scenario. I'm creating a narrow table scenario where as soon as I connect to this people data from a person, I have contact data. What is that? I type in a phone number. It's all digits. This contact type can look at this field and see, do I only have numbers in here and maybe some dashes? If I do, well, that's probably a phone number, and this could auto-enter as a phone number. It can also look at this field contact data and say, well, I've got an @ symbol in here. Do I have any spaces? Oh, there's an @ symbol and there's no spaces? I can pretty well guess that that's an email, and contact type can automatically be an email. So what happens now is you're using, and Google does this a lot, by the way, you're using the data to infer what that data is. What type of data? Is it a phone number versus an email? And your solution, you're making your solution smart based on the data. But additionally, you're then providing the user with the opportunity to override that or classify that. So let's say for some reason somebody puts in a phone number, but rather than using the X to represent extension, they like to use the @ symbol to say, this is the phone number 800 whatever digits at 1234 as their extension. And that might confuse your data determiner, which is going to determine the type from an email. You would still be able to come up with logic that determines that type of data. And Google does this. You type in things and it just sort of knows. And you'd have to add that into FileMaker. But you can always add the manual override. And of course, the human readable label allows us to further classify that. So in our data field, we've got a phone number. Our data type actually tells us, actually contact is becoming really confusing to me right now. I'm thinking of a contact when this is actually, it's a data type. And this is where FileMaker is really flexible. I can rename these at any point in time to make them more coherent to what I'm actually creating. But the label is just further classification of this data. Is it a work phone number versus a home phone number? And that's what we can do. With these 3 fields, we can handle a lot of different pieces of data. In fact, we can handle an unlimited number of phone numbers and an unlimited number of emails for a given person. So now we just think about this. Okay, well, there is a phone number. Here's my cell phone. There is a phone number that I have for me that is my primary number. It is my default number. That's fine. Let's just make a default number. You can add a field and make that the default, or there's many other ways that you can tag a given record as being the default first phone number to try before all of the other numbers. So let's connect this and then we'll wrap this, this video up. How do we connect people to people details? It is really simple. You just add what's known as a foreign key. So in this case, foreign key is super simple. To me, it is also named ID, where ID is always the primary, uniquely identifying piece of information for any and every record. But in order to connect it to another table, you simply just specify the table name. So ID people in this case, and I'll type in foreign key, very clearly says to me, in this solution, this is an ID. I know that it's a foreign key by virtue of the fact that it is not just ID alone, but I now also know that it is tied to the people table. So if I have another foreign key in this particular table where I'm going to connect some type of contact data to something, I would be able to do that. Let's take a hypothetical situation that I am also tracking businesses or companies. That's a very common thing. In fact, people are something that works within a company. It would be possible to use this exact same table, which in this case, people details now doesn't make sense anymore, does it? We might want to rename this to contact details. In fact, thinking about it, let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to call this contact details and change that because my thought process has just evolved. If I'm also going to track businesses, let's say labs, those labs have a direct number. It doesn't go to a person, but I do want to track that phone number. Do I really need to have a separate phone number field in a businesses table when I have one in people as well? Why not just share it? So let's go ahead and put in the table, companies, and we will create that. Now, one of the things that I do here when I develop, you'll notice that I tend to go in the plural. There are some developers that they would name this company with a Y as such. I didn't want that. The debate, it's up to you. Whether you go plural or whether you go singular is up to you. I wanted to rename that, but we will we'll go ahead and just I'll rename this to unused change. There we go. And we'll keep that at companies. I know I'll be adding another table. So let's connect this within our contact details. Within contact details, companies has an ID value, right? But we would have a phone number for a company. Let's go over to our tables. We will go to double click on our contact details. Is it now possible to use this same table, which is currently very narrow because we only have one field that's actually tracking the piece of information, just one field, can now support two different entities, a person and a company. And all we have to do is add a new foreign key. So we will call this ID companies, and we will create it. So this one table is now connected, or will be connected, to both of those tables. So here we will have people, and we will have our contact details, and our companies got added as well. And we will be able to connect both of these to our structure. So an ID for a person is going to connect to the ID of the people. That means that we are going to have phone numbers and email addresses for this, for any person record in this, but we can also connect it here as well. Now, we're not going to be able to do this necessarily. Well, we can right now. Sometimes what will happen is you will create what FileMaker sees as a circular relationship. In this situation, we're not, but we have to think about this. In the contact details, we ask ourselves, simply looking at our structure, is it okay for this table to have these three pieces of information but not have one of these? Sure, it's perfectly fine. It's okay if we have a record that's designated as a contact detail for a company as opposed to a contact detail for a person. And essentially what we have done in this regard is we have now created what is known as a very narrow table structure. This is highly efficient and will allow this database to scale quite well because our storage is not being additive. We're not adding 3, 4, 5 phone numbers, 3, 4, 5 emails to different entities just based on our narrow thinking within our niche. We're thinking now generally in terms of what we're dealing with, not students, not instructors, not vendors, not clients, people with information that we need to use to contact those people. New entities, companies, they are buildings with a physical location somewhere that people go into, and that building does have a contact piece of information that's separate from the person that is in the building that I contact. All right, so I know I've gone a little long in this video, but I think these types of lessons are the things that before you start a FileMaker solution, or if you evaluate the one that you currently have, you'll be able to have these aha moments with regards to data structure that you're like, oh my gosh, that's true. I can see in my database, when I look at this, I've got this same field and I've got 15 of them. I should have structured that differently by giving it its own table and then just connecting it and normalizing the data. So we will be evolving this as we go along. Let's see if we've got any questions for this video, and I'll wrap this up. And the next one, we'll probably start to lay out the data on here. Decide whether we're going to stay in the capture or whether the UI is going to be tied to a person. Talk about the pros and cons of picking a table occurrence that is the actual table where the data is going, or picking a different table context and having the data just be related somewhere outside of what the user is looking at. Because FileMaker can do that. You do not always have to be on the layout of the data that you are working on. You can be on a layout that is disassociated and provides a completely different user interface and model depending on what you want to do and how you want to have the user use that solution. All right, so let's see if there's any questions that came in. Good question came in from Peter. All right, I'll just copy in that because that's only, I don't have that on here. Let's see if I can pop this out. Pop out the chat. There we go. I'm using their dark mode on this one. So the question came in, how do you find records from the parent context based on related records? All right, now this is a point of contention for some developers when it comes to the speed of performance and finding. And let's talk about this really quickly. I mean, I'll go ahead and go long because this works for this particular situation. All right. Here is my table. My table only has a first name and a last name. That contact piece of information, it's not in here. The native mode for FileMaker in order to do a search is called query by form. So when I'm going to find this, I can go into find mode with Command or Control F. I am now ready to search this data, but the data that I'm searching for isn't in this table. It's in a table that is separate from this table and not connected. That in many ways can pose a problem to any newer user because they don't necessarily know how to go search for that, but then end up on the record that you want. Now, unless you're going to be doing a search where you are going to search for the combination of data, so that would be, I am going to look for my last name of Petrowsky and then a sequence of 3 of the digits within my phone number. In that particular case, you would want to have that. For the fastest find performance, you would want to have that in this same table. FileMaker would just be faster that way. But if we contrast that to, if we're going to be looking up a customer based on their phone number, sort of like when we go into a grocery store, we're just going to type in a phone number and then we want to find that and bring up the person. It's very easy to simply create what's known as a global field here in FileMaker. The data is input by the user. We go to the contact details. We search, I'll go into find mode here. We search this database, searching the contact data, and then through virtue of the relationships on the graph, so let's look at it here. So the user inputs, I don't have a global field right now, but we would, in our UI, have a global field somewhere. The user puts in the data, we go to the contacts, we find the phone number that they want, and then we go back up into the people because the connection exists, and we take the user right to that particular record. So it's always a balance of performance versus functionality. And this is a great question, Peter. Let me address this. Since a phone number is a common thing that you have for users, this is something that I will do in a particular system. So in my people table, I do know that there will happen to be a default phone number. Something I want to be able to store multiple phone numbers, but I also want to know which is the first one I should use. In that regard, what I will put in is add a phone number field into the people table, but one and only one. Because what happens is when I add this default phone, I would be able to search for both the first name and the 3 digits of the phone number, but I have to know that by virtue of the fact that in the details, that phone number exists here and it also exists here. So I have duplicate data. As long as I can keep those in sync such that when I implement the user interface, when I'm looking at contacts details, which will be through a portal, when I select one of those phone numbers to be the default, what happens is that simply gets copied over into people. So I'm looking at a portal, which we will see. I select the phone number that I want for the default. It makes a copy of the data into here. The performance hit that I'm taking is the amount or the size of data that I am duplicating. So for however many phone numbers that I have in contact details, I have a duplicate in people. Again, some developers, they don't necessarily like that, but again, this comes at the trade-off of, do you want efficient storage and high performance, and then you're going to negotiate how the data is going to be searched for, or do you want convenience and just be able to search for any phone number? And if you want convenience, go ahead in your people table, add 5 phone number fields. issue you're going to have there is simply just one of management, because for however many fields you add to your solution and the wider that you make it, that adds to your technical debt in terms of what you have to deal with. But there is nothing wrong with it. I am not here to tell anybody, don't add 5 phone number fields. I'm here to say, make the choice that if in your situation, you are searching on 3 different phone number fields plus other data as part of your queries, that's the route that you need to take because that's what your solution dictates. But if you can come up with an alternative search method, by all means, normalize the data and put it into a structure that's going to be more efficient if you can. All right, so that was the only question that I had so far. So thank you, guys, for checking in and watching this video. And I will see you in the next one. I hope this helps you out. Much luck to you. And until next time, happy FileMaking.